या देवी सर्वभूतेषु विद्यारूपेण संस्थिता नमस्तस्यै 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 नमो नमः. નમસ્કાર વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો. ડૉક્ટર બાબા સાહેબ આંબેડકર ઓપન યુનિવર્સિટી દ્વારા સંચાલિત સેટેલાઇટ ઓપન એન્ડ ડિસ્ટન્સ લર્નિંગ પરામર્શન કાર્યક્રમમાં આપ સૌનું ફરી એક વખત હાર્દિક સ્વાગત છે. વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો, આપ જાણો છો તેમ આપણે શનિ અને રવિવારે MA ઇંગ્લિશ અંતર્ગત ચર્ચાને લઈને મળીએ છીએ. આજે આપણે MA ઇંગ્લિશ અંતર્ગત MEG 1ની ચર્ચા કરવાના છીએ. આ વિષયની ચર્ચાની શરૂઆત કરું અને હું આપને આપણા મહેમાનનો પરિચય કરાવું એ પહેલાં હું આપને અમારા ગાંધીનગર સ્ટુડિયો પરના નંબર્સ જણાવી દઉં. જો આપને કંઈ પણ મુશ્કેલી છે તો આપ ચર્ચા દરમિયાન આ નંબર્સનો ઉપયોગ કરી શકો છો. 232 13 096, 232 13 097, 232 13 101 અને ફેક્સ નંબર છે 232 13 102. તમારી સ્ક્રીન પર તમે જોઈ રહ્યા છો. આ નંબર્સનો ઉપયોગ આપ 3 કલાક સુધી કરી શકો છો. વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો, આજે આપણે MEG 1ની જે ચર્ચા કરી રહ્યા છે એમાં વિષયની વિશદ ચર્ચા માટે આપણી સાથે વિષય નિષ્ણાત તરીકે અહીં ઉપસ્થિત છે ડૉક્ટર સંજય મુખર્જી સર. મુખર્જી સર, આપનું સ્ટુડિયોમાં સ્વાગત છે.
થેન્ક યુ.
મુખર્જી સર સિનિયર આસિસ્ટન્ટ પ્રોફેસર, ડિપાર્ટમેન્ટ ઓફ ઇંગ્લિશ એન્ડ CLS, સૌરાષ્ટ્ર યુનિવર્સિટી, રાજકોટ સાથે સંકળાયેલા છે. હાલ આપણી સાથે અહીં વિષય નિષ્ણાત તરીકે ઉપસ્થિત છે. હું એઓનું સ્વાગત પણ કરું અને એઓને વિનંતી કરું કે આજના પરામર્શનની શરૂઆત કરે. મુખર્જી સર.
Thank you, madam. A very warm Sunday afternoon and a very warm greeting to all dear student friends. At first, let me thank Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. I especially thank Professor Avdesh Kumar Singh and, of course, the lady who just introduced me, Ms. Dharmini Mehta. Today we are going to discuss for an extended period of time the course which is in your MEG 1, which is British Poetry. And to open the discussion, we take the Romantic period in British poetry. We will try to cover in our discussion today 3 very important poets who are often grouped together as the first generation English Romantic poets. There is, however, a difference of opinion regarding the first poet that we are going to discuss, who is William Blake. He is often called the precursor to the Romantic poets, that is the precursor to the English Romantics. However, we are going to discuss William Blake, we are going to discuss William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The mode of our discussion, my talk reaching out to you, would be through a presentation that you can see on your screen, as well as I would read out certain aspects, I would read out certain portions of poetry, which is very important, of course. You all know that poetry has a very important aspect, that is the oral aspect. That is, poetry should fall upon your ears. And if it doesn't do that, we are really not fully aware of the intricacies and the power of words that go on to make poetry. Well, as you can see on your screen, we begin the discussion not straight away with the discussion on the individual poets, but let us try to understand what this term is. In fact, one of the most important and very difficult or a complex problem that literary historians have in front of them is to periodize any group of writers and then to name that period. And that is where we shall begin our discussion. that is the complexity of naming temporally, giving it a time frame to collectively a group of writers, authors, and then calling them by a name. In our case, the group of poets whom we are going to discuss, they have been called the Romantic poets. And as you can now see, that the first point is the difficulty of ascertaining. The most important aspect is to group these poets into a time frame. That is, literary historians have been debating as to what is the starting point of English Romantic poetry. And as you can see that there are two schools of opinion that exist. The first school, they believe that the beginning should be 1789. As you all know, many of you would certainly know, 1789 would ring a bell because a very important event happened in the history of Europe on that particular year, and we are talking about the French Revolution. The French Revolution of 1789, what it did was, the European society, which was basically governed by monarchy, that system of governance was overthrown and abolished, and a new way of governing, at least theoretically, it was formulated in 1789. We shall talk about that in detail very soon. But I want to remind you that the other school of opinion that exists as regards periodizing this particular Romantic period is not from 1789 but from 1798. If you reverse the last two numerical digits, 89, you reverse it to 98. And what happened in 1798 is that a very important literary event happened in England. That is, the publication of lyrical ballads took place in 1798. As you certainly know, that lyrical ballads, an anthology of poetry, which was jointly brought out by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So this is the first aspect that I wish to draw your attention to, that is the difficulty of naming the period and the alternative two dates available to all of us, 1789 and 1798. Now the next important thing about if a period has to begin at a particular date, then the period has to come to an end also at a particular date or a particular year. In that regard, there is almost complete agreement among the literary historians, and they believe that it is 1832 when English Romanticism came to an end. There are quite a few reasons given for selecting this year as the end of the Romantic period. The first one that is on your screen, Walter Scott, the Scottish historical novelist, he died in that particular year. And a major voice remains no more, and with him we come to draw an end to this Romantic period. Although if you read your text and when you read your literary history book, you will realize that one of the most important poets of this period, whom we are going to discuss, William Wordsworth, is very much alive in 1832. In fact, he will go on to become the poet laureate, and he will go on to live for another almost 2 decades, dying in the year 1850. But the period, Romantic period in England, is not brought to a close with the death of William Wordsworth. That is an interesting aspect I want to draw your attention to. But with Walter Scott's death in 1832. In 1832 also, politically and socially, what happened was the reform bills were introduced. These reform bills are basically reform for voting rights. Till then, in England, only the aristocracy, the House of Lords, the upper house, a certain class of nobility, they had a say in running the society. From 1832 onwards, the other classes of the society, they started demanding their right to have a say in the running of their own society. And therefore, these reform bills began to be introduced from the year 1832. Another reason given for 1832 is it is seen by economists and it is seen by sociologists that from the 1830s onwards, the English society took a very definite turn from being an agriculture-based society, that is an agrarian society, a feudal agrarian society, to, you will recall the phrase industrial revolution. With the rise of this industrial revolution, riding the wave of industrial revolution, we come to England changing itself into an industrial society managed gradually by not a feudal government anymore, but gradually by an elected government. So these are some of the important reasons why, as we just mentioned, that 1832 is often said to be the last year of English Romantic period. Now let us look at what does the word Romanticism mean. The endeavor to look at a root of a word, as you might know, is perhaps called the etymological research of any word. That is, try to find where does a particular word come from. You would know, of course, like in India, Sanskrit was the mother language of all, at least the North Indian languages that later on developed, and I'm excluding Tamil and the other South Indian languages from it. But like Sanskrit, which was the mother language from where many Indian languages drew their roots, and therefore you will find even in many Gujarati words you can trace the roots to the Sanskrit words. Similarly, in Europe, the mother language was Greek and then Latin. So many of the words that we have to understand properly while doing our English literature course, many of the difficult words, if you make a search, etymological search, you will realize that their roots go all the way up to the Greek and the Latin civilization and the Greek and the Latin languages. Now, the word Romanticism, it comes from the Latin word Romanicus. You just saw on your, and now again it is there on your screen. It comes with from the Latin word Romanicus, meaning of Rome. That is, the languages that were developing, the vernacular languages, the vernacular European languages like French, Spanish, English, etc., that developed from the Renaissance onwards, European Renaissance onwards. Now the term of Rome or Romanicus specially means that it refers to knowledge in those vernacular European languages and not Greek and Latin. That is an important root of the word Romanticism. However, after the language, which is, as we just saw, the European vernacular language, we come to talk about what Romanticism is. As you just saw, it is basically a tale. Romanticism often refers to a narrative. It refers to a tale. In the medieval, what is called the Romance languages, the vernaculars getting established in the European society, and a tale told in these languages with themes, as you can see on your screen, that the themes were generally courtly love, knights, chivalric exploits, such other sentimental topics. And therefore, one of the meaning of the word romantic is connected to what we loosely know, that is of love. But basically, we are going to narratives and tales that had an element of chivalry and love in it. So that is another way of understanding the word Romanticism, the term Romanticism. As we would do Romantic poetry, then with our understanding, etymological understanding of Romanticism, we will find just a word or two would not be enough in our romantic vocabulary. In fact, you will have a whole list of words when you try to understand or when you try to read any critical analysis on romantic poetry. And the list is now given on your screen. These would be the oft repeated words that would time and again come when you try to read on romantic poetry. For example, subjectivity. That is, the poem, the piece of literature that comes to you would not have an objective point of view, but the poem would be narrated, or the poem would be reflected upon. You would come to know the poem from a subjective point of view, from the point of view of the particular poet who is writing it. Also, there would be some kind of, in that subjectivity, some kind of a desire reflected in the poem, desire generally for some kind of an ideal. You will also see that imagination becomes a very key word in romantic vocabulary. We shall talk about imagination at a little length in a short while from now. But imagination becomes a very important ingredient of romantic poetry, and the poems that you would read, you will be amazed at looking at or trying to grasp at the imaginative quality of the poet who writes such a poem. Often imagination would move into fantasy. That is, the world that will be presented to you, the world would be not the 19th century Europe, but would be the 14th or the 15th century Europe, the medieval or the Gothic Europe. And there, an author has to use a lot of fantasy to conjure the medieval world, the Gothic world. The Gothic itself means a bundle of things. It is often meant by the Gothic a strange kind of beauty, a dark kind of a charm, an enigma, a tale wherein there are castles, there is murder, there is incest, there are witches, and there are stranded women, beautiful women, night. All these are material for the Gothic. Romantic poetry would include a lot of introspection, a lot of rumination. romantic poetry would not simply be description or narration, but often the poet would go within his own mind, or often the poet would use the word within his own soul and introspect, ruminate about very important aspects of life. In that connection, we will have a lot of nostalgia, a lot of memory for a particular good lost past that was lost and that needs to be revived but somehow cannot be revived. In that sense, then, with the memory and the nostalgia, the poet will often recollect the far away and the long ago. This is a phrase often used in the romantic vocabulary. This is a phrase you will read often when you find Keats' poetry is being discussed, and he goes back all the way to the Greek civilization. This is the phrase then that is used, the far away and the long ago. You will find in romantic poetry another important aspect, that is childhood, the child and the innocence of childhood being talked about. Finally, nature, and this aspect all of you know. Nature as a wild landscape, nature as the countryside. So the focus in romantic poetry moves away from the city, the town London was developing into a city then. The focus of the period before the romantic period, that is the neoclassical period, was often the town, the city. But romantic poetry moves away from the town, from the city, and moves to the natural wild landscape and moves to the countryside. The next aspect, we should, after etymology, after important key words, that is the vocabulary of romanticism, we must go to the background. And the first is what we just discussed, the political cultural background, when we just talked about the French Revolution in our first slide. French Revolution created a major transformation. It was basically a socio-political transformation, but it was more importantly an intellectual transformation which happened in France from 1787 to a decade or 12-year long period. And this revolution took the entire Europe, the writers, the thinkers, the artists of Europe by storm. The nature of transformation in the Romantic Revolution, in the French Revolution, was that a society based on absolute monarchy was transformed into a republic. That is, at least theoretically, the republic was created on the basis of a mantra of 3 words. The mantra of 3 words, the 3 words were liberty, equality, and fraternity. King Louis XVI, who was ruling France at that point of time, his throne was snatched away. His fortress, Bastille, was taken away from him on 14th July 1789, and this date, this year, is a very significant cultural, political, intellectual year in the history of Europe, which then influenced arts and literature. So this is one aspect that we talk about, the French Revolution. Now, the fall of the Bastille, what it also did symbolically was that when the monarchy was gone, the old order, or what was called in French the Ancien Régime, the old order of politically ruling the society, was the entire old order was done away with, was removed. And what happened then, important events that happened, They were the drafting of the rights and constitution for the people at large. Experiments happened with democracy, how to create a democratic society, not an autocratic society. The autocratic society, the tyrannical one-man ruler society was done away with. The other power in Europe at that point of time, from the state, the other power was the church. And one of the important things that the French Revolution strived to do was to incorporate, to bring into the fold the church into state. That would be, church would be subordinated by under the state. And of course, there would be a drafting of an administrative and a law code. It would no longer be a case of what the king thinks is right and therefore what the king thinks is the law, but there would be a drafted law code, and then it was said that then this law code would be applicable irrespective of whatever class the person belonged to. These were the important things that were endeavored in this period. Now you might have a question in your mind that how come the French Revolution, what were the causing factors? How did it happen? What were the causes of the French Revolution? When a societal revolution takes place, it is generally not any one particular cause that is ascertained to it, but historians then look at causes. And as you can see, economic reason was one of the important reasons. There was a rising price of essential commodities like that of bread, and when the price of essential commodities rise, the common man who are more in number, they are affected, and a kind of disgruntlement, resentment, unhappiness starts building up in the large mass of people. The social factor was also an important cause in the French Revolution. That is, more and more people felt that the middle class, or as you see the word bourgeoisie, the middle class or the bourgeoisie, this class was neglected by the king, and the nobility and the clergy, the people, the church people and the nobility, they were rather given a lot of preference, a lot of grants, and a lot of partiality was shown to them. This was another reason of resentment among the rest of the large number of the people in France. There was also a political reason. That is, often we have a perception of a leader in our society, and the perception of Louis XVI was that he was not a very strong king. That is how he was looked upon. He was looked upon as fundamentally, basically a weak leader, a weak ruler, and as a result, his policies, his way of governance was often seen as inefficient and arbitrary. So these are the three important factors: economic factor, the social factor, and the political factor that added fuel to the French Revolution. From the cultural factors, let us move to what happened in literature, what the French Revolution did or could do for literature. Now, French Revolution, when you read the history of Europe, or when you read the history of France, or when you even read literary history around that time, you will read that the French Revolution ultimately failed. It was not successful. Yet, in literature, it could usher in permanent changes in literature occurred which were never there before. The important change that happened was in the genre or in the form of literature. What happened actually was that when monarchy was abolished, when the king was done away with, and the feudal structure was dismantled, it meant that certain literary forms that were supported, that were more the court forms of performance or literature, that is, the epic and the tragedy or the drama, these forms started going out of vogue. And what happened was that there was the birth of the very personal genre of literature, that is poetry, and within poetry again an intensely personal and emotional genre of poetry, that is the lyric. So the literary repercussion that happened of the French Revolution was that the important forms like the epic and the tragedy, they were replaced by poetry and various forms of poetry. You will be quite amazed to see when you read this period that poetry becomes the most important genre of the Romantic period. The English Romantic period, certainly poetry happens to be the most important genre. And although novel is being written, Walter Scott we just mentioned, Jane Austen would be writing novels, although she is not technically often considered as a romantic. She is temporarily a romantic, but technically not a romantic. But we are digressing from poetry to novel writing. Novel writing did happen. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein and other novels. But you will find generally there is a predominance of the form of poetry that happens in this particular period. That is, when the common man is given a platform, when common man start realizing their identity, then what happens is that the common man's language also is given importance. So one of the things that happens with this rise of poetry is the rise of a certain kind of poetic diction and the rise of certain depiction of characters who are no longer from the elite aristocratic class, but they belong to the humble, to the rustic class. So this ascendancy of the common man gives rise to the ascendancy of literary and the folk form, especially as you can see the ballad and the intensely personal ones like the sonnet and the ode. In this sense, as you see that the French, that we can ascertain, we can say that French Revolution could really bring about a democratization of literature, a democratization in terms of the genre, that is the forms of literature, the diction, the language used, and the themes. The themes were no longer those that interested the nobility. The themes were themes taken from ordinary life, and of course the characters who themselves were humble, rustic, ordinary, country folk. Such people were the mainstay characters in the Romantic poetry. The another background that we must talk about, we talked of in our first slide two dates, that is, we talked of 1789 and we discussed the French Revolution, and then we spoke of another year, 1798, and that was a very important year in terms of the English literature, the history of English literature. And it was the year when the lyrical ballads, the group of poems, that anthology of poems called the lyrical ballads. This lyrical ballads, it was published, and it ushered a certain kind of poetry that was till then not in vogue. Lyrical ballads was conceived jointly by Wordsworth and Coleridge. It was conceived at around 1797 when these two poets got together. They thought about it and about its conception, how this entire anthology was conceived, and how the division of labor, who will do what among these two poets. That decision was arrived at. About this important decision, Samuel Taylor Coleridge has left a record in his Biographia Literaria, chapter 14, and I would like to present to you that record where he says, and I quote him, "The thought suggested itself, to which of us I do not recollect." That is, Samuel Taylor Coleridge is really not able to recollect when he writes Biographia Literaria more than 15 years later, around 15 years later, that who struck upon this idea. He can no longer recollect that, but both of them hit upon this idea, and therefore he says, "The thought suggested itself that a series of poems might be composed of two sorts. In the one, the incidents and agents were to be, in part at least, supernatural. For the second class, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. The characters and incidents were to be such as will be found in every village." So, you see that they hit upon this idea. They came to a kind of a decision that they must include poems of two sorts. One would be such poems that would evoke a supernatural order of things, and the other would be absolutely natural, what is seen, but because it is seen in front of our eyes, it is often neglected. It is not talked about because it is not the decorated life, the decorated way of living that happens, and therefore it is often not considered as important to be drawn as poetic or literary material. So this was the beginning of the great literary revolution, and Coleridge continues that in this idea originated the plan of the lyrical ballads, in which it was agreed that my endeavors should be directed to persons and characters supernatural or at least romantic. Now you find another vocabulary word getting attached to the romantic vocabulary, that is supernatural. So what Coleridge says, characters that are supernatural or at least romantic. Mr. Wordsworth, on the other hand, was to propose to himself as his object to give the charm of novelty to things of every day. So this was the division of labor that took place between these two great friends. As we just said, lyrical ballads ushered in what is called new poetry, and the new poetry was ushered in with an advertisement by Wordsworth, in which he specifically mentions about the gaudy and inane phraseology of poems till then being written. This mention of poetic diction, Wordsworth would certainly further elaborate and then put in his celebrated preface to the second edition, where Wordsworth, in that preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, he would not only criticize the gaudy and inane phraseology of his contemporary and predecessor poets, but he would also try to define what poetry is and how poetry really should be looked at. This is a very famous definition, and I would like to read out to you, as you can follow on your screen, what Wordsworth said about poetry, how Wordsworth defined poetry. And what he said is, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till, by a species of reaction, the tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced, and does itself actually exist in the mind. In this mood, successful composition generally begins. This is how Wordsworth defined poetry, and it was such an important definition that it is often considered, Wordsworth's definition of poetry is often paralleled with Aristotle's definition of tragedy. In a way, therefore, what happened was a break in which poetry itself was looked at till then, or the break that happened between the Romantics and their new classical predecessors, or all of their predecessors, we might even venture to say. What happened actually was that for the Romantics, poetry is a talent or a gift, and this talent and gift a person has to be born with. It cannot be acquired through training. That is a fundamental debate. This debate still goes on in the society, that is an artist born or is an artist made? That is, can one become a poet, a musician, a painter by attending schools of painting, or attending musical classes, or attending creative writing courses? Or is it that the artist, the creator, has something inborn, inherent within himself or herself that generates art? Now, on this ground, the Romantics took a stand, and they took a stand, as you can see on your screen, they took a stand for the inborn talent, and they took a stand against the perception that was there in the new classical era, that if one is educated enough, one has the facility of language, then one can also be trained to become a writer. Therefore, we shall look into a little bit more detail what for the Romantics poetry is. The poetic expression, then, you will find on your screen. Keats has beautifully described what poetry is, and the innate, the natural process of how poetry comes to the poet. And Keats says in one of his very famous, celebrated letters, that if poetry does not come naturally as leaves to a tree, then it better not come at all. So, like nobody dictates the leaves to come on a bough, on a branch of a tree. Leaves sprout, they germinate naturally. There is something inherent in the stem, in the branch, in the trunk of the tree that germinates leaves, flowers. In the same way, from the creator, from the poet, from the artist, poetry, art should come forth. That is what Keats believed. And this natural or the organic principle of poetry was supported by Coleridge, who speaks of a vital ingredient that helps this organic, synthetic, natural process. And that ingredient for Coleridge is the very important, the vital ingredient of imagination, which Coleridge calls as the soul of poetic genius. Talking about Blake, talking about Shelley, all romantic poets agreed to this view that poetry has to do with an inborn talent, something which is a reservoir that a person is born with. Blake talked about the inner light, the inner evidence, and said that poetry came due to a vision, due to some kind of a divine inspiration, and due to some kind of a prophetic incident happening, and the poet himself then becomes not just a writer, but he becomes a creator, he becomes a prophet. He is no longer an artisan, he is no longer polishing the sentences, he is creating language, he is the birth giver of the vital thing that society has, that human beings have. For Shelley, the element of spontaneity again is of prime importance, and he believes that poetry takes its origin in moments of, again, divine inspiration, and this divinely inspired poetry cannot be willed. A writer cannot, getting up one fine day in the morning, decide, take a page in front of him, a blank page, and decide, today I will write a great lyric, or today I will compose the first chapter of my novel. That act of will doesn't operate in writing, in creating. And that is what Shelley believed. It is not the domain of the act of will, it is neither the domain of reasoning. So neither the domain of reasoning nor the domain of the determination or the act of will. This, of course, brings us to two great critics talking about romanticism, and it is these descriptions rather than definitions that one has to take into account in order to understand this period. You will see by the end of this slideshow that the period called Romanticism is one of the most difficult to be defined. But if it cannot be defined in a very proper, watertight definition, it can perhaps be described in an unending manner. And two very important 20th century critics who have culled out salient features of Romanticism, I first give you the salient points of M.H. Abrams. You might have perhaps come across, or you will perhaps now come across, M.H. Abrams's book, which one should, as a postgraduate student of English literature, refer to. It is a glossary of literary terms by M.H. Abrams. One should refer to that. M.H. Abrams is also credited as being the most important 20th century romantic critic. He is a critic who has again brought back romantic literature into discussion, and two of his great works helped in this debate, discussion, further writing, seminars on Romanticism. These two of his great books are, one is called The Mirror and the Lamp, and the other is called Natural Supernaturalism. In Mirror and the Lamp, M.H. Abrams takes the romantic view of literature, and as we just discussed, he borrows this view of literature which all romantic writers supported by saying that literature no longer remained a mirror, that is, you hold in front of the society and life goes on and the mirror reflects life. But what happened is M.H. Abrams talked about taking inspiration from all the romantic poets who talked about the inherent, innate nature of what literature should be. He said literature was perceived not as a mirror, but as a lamp, as a light giver, as an illuminator. And this is a very important work that came out in the late 60s, if I am not mistaken. His other work coming out in the 70s is, as I just mentioned, natural supernaturalism. About supernaturalism, we have just had our discussion. Supernatural element is an important vocabulary word in the romantic group of words, and the aspect of the supernatural as if was made usual, common, natural in a way that no longer surprises or gives a kind of a shock to people. In that sense, M.H. Abrams often uses this title, natural supernaturalism, and the other title, the mirror and the lamp. So M.H. Abrams talks about 5 important features of romanticism, the 5 salient points of romanticism. We shall read these 5 points and then take a short break. The first one we have just discussed. We have discussed that the first feature is the nature of poetry itself. We have just talked about it, so I am quickly going over to the next point. The next point is, that is, romantic poetry, romantic literature believed in innovation over traditionalism in materials, forms, style, an emphasis on the supernatural, the far away and the long ago we just discussed, assuming the persona of a prophet in a poet. The poet is not only just a writer, he is a seer, he is a prophet, and such a prophet, such a seer uses poetic symbolism in which objects are charged with a significance beyond their physical qualities. So, when we discuss Blake, we will come back to talking about symbolism. These are the 2 characteristics, salient features, and the other 3 are, that is, the predominance of external nature in poetry. Now, nature in romantic poetry does not play the function only of describing a beautiful scenery, but it is a very important, invisible, positive force. It's this invisible, this positive force stimulates the poet to engage his mind in deep thinking and meditation. Meditation not just in the spiritual sense, but meditate to reflect on the central human experiences and problems. So nature's role, a very significant nature's role, was an important aspect of romantic poetry. The 4th point was creating the poetic persona, which was, we talked about subjectivity. The I in romantic poetry is not any imaginary character, an invented persona, but I in the romantic poetry is the poet himself. And this poet, this I, would generally be depicted as a solitary figure who would either be a non-conformist, he would not conform to the rules of the society because he would believe these rules are artificial, they are imposed upon from outside. He would therefore be a rebel or an outcast. He would no longer belong to the organized society. He would move away to a secluded place, and he would often then be engaged in a long and sometimes infinitely elusive quest, the quest for an ideal. Keats often found this quest in the Greek civilization, that is, he went back in the past. Shelley went ahead to some kind of an utopian future. Byron often talked about the contemporary present and how things can be reformed, and therefore he used a great deal of irony to depict the contemporary present. The last point of M.H. Abrams before we break for a short period is the inspiration once again of the French Revolution, which we have talked about, and the only important addition which I am going to make here is that with this revolution, all the writers, especially the first generation romantics like Blake, Southey, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they believed that this was a great age of new beginnings and high possibilities. This was the time when things would be freshly structured. They would happen in a way which would remove all decadence from this existing society, and a new world order would come into existence. This was a belief, a strong belief by all the romantic poets. Let us, dear friends, take a short break now and come back quickly again.
વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો, આપણી આ ચર્ચામાં અહીંયા એક નાનકડો બ્રેક લઈએ છીએ. માત્ર 5 મિનિટના વિરામ બાદ આ જ વિષયની ચર્ચાને આપણે આગળ વધારીએ છીએ. અહીં એક નાનકડો બ્રેક લઈએ છીએ. નમસ્કાર.